Get out! You're not the kind of customer we serve here." The bank manager snarled as two security guards grabbed the black man's arms, dragging him across the polished lobby while customers stared, some recording gleefully, others pretending not to see. No questions, no ID check, just an order barked like he was dangerous for even daring to stand there in a suit, folder in hand, trying to make a deposit. The hush in the room wasn't respect, it was complicity. And as they shoved him through the door, no one knew the truth. They weren't throwing out a scammer. They were humiliating the bank's most powerful shareholder. Stick around to see how that one decision changes everything. John Thompson stepped out of his black sedan, adjusting the sleeve of his tailored navy suit as he surveyed the grand facade of First Eastern Bank. The glass doors gleamed in the morning light, polished to a fault, their mirrored surface reflecting his calm, composed expression. This bank was a testament to wealth, order, and tradition, values John respected deeply, even invested in. He smoothed his tie, took a steadying breath, and walked in with measured steps, the echo of his leather shoes swallowed by plush carpeting. Inside, the lobby buzzed with quiet conversation. Chandeliers threw soft light on marble floors, and the air smelled of fresh coffee and corporate ambition. The queue snaked toward a long mahogany counter where four tellers worked briskly, greeting each customer with wide, eager smiles. John paused a moment, reading the framed plaque near the entrance that boasted excellence, trust, service. He smiled at the irony already forming in his mind. He had always been a man who liked to see the best in people, but he'd also learned to spot the subtle tightening of a jaw, the shifting of eyes, the small cues that telegraphed unspoken assumptions. He carried with him a thick manila folder containing important papers that authorized his deposit of several $1,000,000 into one of the bank's flagship accounts. This wasn't the first time he'd made a large transaction here. He had an account manager on call. He even sat on the board. But today, he chose to handle this himself. He wanted to feel the place, see the staff in action, test the waters, without fanfare or special treatment. But the waters proved murky from the start. As he stepped into the line, the woman at the desk, Melissa, looked up from her screen. Her polite banker's smile flickered for the briefest instant before returning, and she pressed a small button below her desk without breaking eye contact. John noticed the tiny motion. He noticed, too, how the security guard standing by the door shifted slightly, straightening his posture, adjusting the radio on his shoulder. It was so subtle it might have been missed by anyone who hadn't spent years watching people's faces for mask slipping. John didn't react. He had no reason to. He simply nodded politely at the guard, who didn't return the gesture. Instead, the man squinted slightly, the universal expression of forced evaluation, as if he were trying to classify a species he hadn't seen before. The woman in front of John, a well-dressed older white lady, turned briefly to glance at him. She clutched her handbag a little tighter against her side, her fingers twitching on the gold clasp. She offered a thin smile, just wide enough to suggest civility, while her eyes darted between John and the guard. John remained still, breathing evenly, his eyes scanning the teller windows. He saw another teller lean over and whisper something to her colleague, her eyes cutting in his direction. He didn't need to hear them. He'd heard the words before in other places. Watch him. Could be trouble. Look at that suit. Looks rented. John held his folder in both hands, tapping it once gently against his palm. He'd been in this situation more times than he could count, though never in his own bank. He thought briefly of walking out, but he wasn't that man anymore. He wouldn't be made to slink away. So he stayed in line, offering the same polite nod to the next customer who approached. That man, a middle-aged white executive with a Bluetooth headset, smiled easily and clapped John on the shoulder with forced joviality. "Busy morning, huh?" John returned the smile, but there was no warmth in it. The executive didn't wait for a reply before striding ahead, waving at one of the tellers who called him by name. When John finally reached the counter, Melissa's smile turned professional but flat. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" Her voice was even, but the stress was in the wrong places, clipped in the way people spoke when they were trying to keep suspicion hidden under politeness. John laid the folder down carefully. "I'm here to make a deposit. Business account. Thompson Holdings." Melissa didn't open the folder immediately. She hesitated, eyes darting down to the large font on the label. Her fingers flexed. Then she glanced over his shoulder at the security guard. The guard nodded slightly, and she opened it, her eyes scanning the first page with deliberate slowness. "That's a significant amount, Mr. Thompson." She read the name as though it might be fake, like she expected it to morph into something more familiar. "Yes," John said calmly. "It's a regular transfer. You'll find all the approvals inside." He waited as she flipped slowly through the pages, her brow furrowing. She leaned to the side slightly, pressing another button under the counter he hadn't seen before. He smiled. Reinforcements already? He wondered. Outside the glass doors, he could see a second guard approaching, hand on his belt, scanning the lobby. John kept his expression neutral. He wasn't surprised. He was rarely surprised anymore. Melissa cleared her throat. "One moment, please." She turned and walked away briskly, carrying the folder, whispering urgently to another teller. That teller nodded and walked toward the back offices, glancing over his shoulder as though John might bolt at any moment. John rested one hand on the counter and the other in his pocket, fingers drumming lightly on his phone. He resisted the urge to call his account manager immediately. Instead, he watched the customers behind him. Some averted their gaze. Others watched with open curiosity. One young man took out his phone and pretended to check messages while angling it to film. John shifted his stance slightly, presenting the best angle for the camera. He didn't mind being filmed. In fact, he welcomed it. This wasn't the first time he'd been made a spectacle, but it might be the last time anyone in this bank tried to do it. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. He wanted to give them every chance to do the right thing. He always gave people a chance to do the right thing, but it was already too late for that. He could feel it in the way the lobby's noise dipped slightly, the way the hush fell as the security guard approached and positioned himself just behind John's right shoulder. John didn't turn to look. He simply waited, patiently, calmly, like a man watching a storm form on the horizon, knowing he'd already built the strongest house in town. He tapped the folder lightly with one finger, the only sound in the hush. The security guard's radio crackled softly. Melissa returned without the folder. She forced another smile, this one brittle enough to crack. "Sir, I'm going to need you to wait here. We're verifying your documents." John arched one eyebrow. "Verifying," he repeated slowly. She nodded once, eyes flicking to the guard again. "It's policy." "Since when?" he asked softly. She didn't answer. The guard took one half-step closer. The tension in the room buzzed like an electrical line ready to snap. John didn't flinch. He just smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. John stood there, hands calmly folded in front of him, watching Melissa fumble with forced composure as she returned to the counter without his folder. The lobby had quieted to a hush, the muted murmur of polite conversation replaced by the scratchy radio static from the guard's belt and the soft click of dress shoes on marble. Melissa cleared her throat but didn't meet his eyes. "Sir, it's going to be a moment," she said, voice brittle. John kept his expression neutral, though his eyes tracked every flicker of discomfort across her face. "Is there an issue with my documentation?" he asked evenly. Melissa's mouth opened and closed once before she managed a thin smile that looked more like a grimace. "It's just unusual. That's a large amount of money. We have to be careful." She almost choked on the last word. John's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned in a fraction, dropping his voice to a low, polite rumble. "I'm sure you apply this level of care to all of your board members." The words hit their target like a dart. She blinked rapidly, her cheeks flushing, but before she could answer, the guard behind John shifted closer, the leather of his belt squeaking. John felt the change in the air immediately, a tightening, the way prey senses the hunter's muscles tensing before a pounce. Melissa straightened, drew in a breath, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped into something carefully controlled, but unmistakably mocking. "Sir," she said with a sweetness that curdled at the edges, "we can't just let anyone make deposits this size. Not without proving you even own the money." She drew out anyone, slicing him open with that single word. It was practiced, deliberate. Her eyes flickered with a challenge. She wasn't brave enough to speak plainly, but the meaning crackled in the silence. Not you. Not people like you. John took a breath. He didn't move. He didn't look at the growing audience behind him, the shifting line of customers pretending to check their phones or examine pamphlets. He focused only on her. His voice was ice. I believe I've given you all the necessary proof. She licked her lips. It's not enough. Management will have to review it. You'll need to wait outside until they decide. John's eyebrow twitched up a millimeter. Wait. Outside. She nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. Outside. For everyone's comfort. The security guard stepped forward, placing himself squarely in John's personal space, his arms folding across his broad chest in a way that showed off his size without subtlety. Sir, the guard intoned, the syllable dropped like a gavel. I think you know why we're asking you to leave. John turned his head slowly to regard the guard. For the briefest second, amusement lit his eyes. I'd love to hear you explain it. The guard's lips twitched in irritation. He wasn't used to pushback. His eyes flicked to Melissa for backup, but she was carefully studying a stack of forms with newfound interest, determined not to intervene. The lobby silence had turned into a thick, uncomfortable tension, as though the entire building was holding its breath. John could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing against him, some curious, some smugly entertained, others clearly uncomfortable with being witnesses but unwilling to step in. He took in the details with forensic precision. The mother turning her child's head away so he wouldn't see. The man in a tailored gray suit pretending to be on a business call while filming the scene with his front-facing camera. The older woman with the pearl earrings shaking her head slowly as though lamenting the state of the world while making no move to help. John cleared his throat once, letting the sound carry, before fixing his gaze back on the guard. You want me to leave, he said carefully. Because I'm making a deposit. The guard's jaw worked. He shifted on his feet, a bead of sweat rolling from his temple to his collar. Because there's a problem, he said finally, voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone that was supposed to sound reasonable, but only revealed his discomfort. Management says they need to verify you. Don't make this harder than it has to be. John exhaled softly, the corner of his mouth twitching at the absurdity. He let his gaze sweep the room once, landing for a heartbeat on the mounted camera in the lobby's corner. He wanted it all recorded. He turned back to the teller. Melissa, he said, voice polite as ever. Do you really want to do this? Because you'll be asked about it later. Her eyes darted up, wide for a fraction of a second before the trained professional mask slammed back down. It's policy, sir, she snapped, the words brittle, defensive, weaponized to make her look like a victim if he dared raise his voice. He didn't. He wouldn't give them that gift. Instead, he smiled, slow and humorless. I see. The guard took another step closer, close enough that John could smell the aftershave and hear the faint tremor in the man's breathing. Sir, let's not make this a scene. Don't make us escort you out. John let the silence drag, savoring the discomfort in the lobby. He could feel the audience shifting uneasily, wanting the confrontation to be over so they could go back to pretending the world was fair. He watched the hypocrisy play out across their faces. He tilted his head, considering, and finally spoke. You'd better call your manager, he said quietly. Now. The guard shook his head slowly, like a disappointed teacher talking to an unruly child. No need. I've got my orders. You're done here. The words felt rehearsed. Maybe they were. Maybe this wasn't the first time he delivered them. John felt his pulse tick up once, but his expression remained calm. He could play this game for hours, but his eyes glittered with the promise of something they didn't yet understand. He adjusted his tie, his movements measured and deliberate, not giving them the satisfaction of any fear. Very well, he murmured. He turned, but not to leave. He turned to look at the lobby, sweeping his gaze across the gathered onlookers, who now tried harder than ever to look away. The guard shifted behind him, clearly uncomfortable with the lack of compliance. John didn't move toward the door. He didn't comply. He just stood, examining the faces around him like a museum exhibit of cowardice and complicity. He took in every uncomfortable shuffle, every forced cough, every pair of eyes darting away. He waited and waited. The guard cleared his throat again. "Sir." John didn't turn back. He let the silence do the talking for him, the kind that wasn't just heavy, it was damning. His breathing slow and steady, he let the moment stretch, knowing he'd just made it impossible for anyone here to pretend this was normal. John stood his ground in the hushed lobby, the air thick with anticipation as he let the silence speak louder than any accusation. The guard shifted from foot to foot, the radio on his belt crackling quietly, waiting for an answer that never came. Melissa refused to meet his eyes, pretending to shuffle papers that no longer held any relevance. The entire bank felt like it had become a theater stage, with John cast as the uninvited performer everyone was forced to watch. The other customers lingered in an uneasy hush, but the silence wasn't compassion, it was complicity. When the guard cleared his throat again, the sound seemed unnaturally loud. "Sir," he repeated with forced calm, "I'm going to have to ask you one last time." John didn't move. His chin lifted a fraction higher. His eyes remained fixed on the lobby, daring anyone there to speak. The tension snapped when the second guard entered, this one broader and younger, his face set in that careful professional blankness meant to hide aggression. He joined the first, forming a wall on either side of John, their arms folding in practiced unison. "Sir, you're creating a disturbance," the first one said, his voice firm now, abandoning any pretense of courtesy. "We're going to escort you out." John exhaled through his nose, the only concession to his growing frustration. He turned just enough to catch Melissa's eye, but she immediately dropped her gaze, pretending to be engrossed in the computer screen. She didn't even bother to hide the relief that someone else would finish what she started. The older woman with the pearls in line let out a tiny gasp when the guard stepped closer, but she didn't move. Instead, she clutched her handbag tighter, her eyes wide and unblinking. No one spoke up. No one offered help. John felt the weight of their silence pressing on him like a physical force, harder even than the guards' hands would soon be. The guards moved in, taking an arm each, their grips firm but measured, practiced in the art of minimizing lawsuits while maximizing humiliation. John let them, refusing to resist, his body going rigid but uncooperative, forcing them to adjust their grip uncomfortably. The entire room watched in transfixed horror or glee. A young man near the ATM whipped out his phone and started recording, angling it carefully to get a full shot of the incident. His face betrayed nothing but cold curiosity, the detached amusement of someone who believed he was capturing content, not a human being's dignity. John felt the camera lens on him like a laser sight. Another customer, a man in a gray suit who'd been pretending to type on his phone earlier, turned away slightly but not enough to miss the show. His finger hovered over his screen, making sure he had the best angle. John didn't give them the satisfaction of struggling. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. He simply let himself be led, the folder with his deposit paperwork forgotten on the counter, where Melissa refused to even glance at it. As they moved him toward the door, the murmur of hushed voices began to rise behind them, like a wave building. "Is he being arrested?" someone whispered too loudly. "Must be a fraud thing," another voice chimed in, dripping with certainty. "I heard he tried to cash a fake check," someone else added, emboldened by the anonymity of the growing crowd. The guards didn't correct them. They didn't care. They just kept moving John, their grips tightening when he dared to slow. At the glass doors, a mother pulled her small daughter closer. The little girl's eyes were huge as she watched John being escorted out, her voice cutting through the lobby with clear innocence. "Mommy," she asked, voice bright and unfiltered. "Why are they kicking that man out?" The question hung in the air like a verdict no one wanted to claim. The mother stiffened, her face coloring. She bent low, whispering harshly, "Shh, don't stare," as she pulled the girl's head toward her chest, hiding her from a scene, but not from the truth. The girl's eyes peeked out anyway, wide and uncomprehending, catching John's for a brief second. He gave her the barest nod, a flicker of human connection in a room that had stripped him of it. The guards didn't notice. They were too focused on their job, faces set in professional scowls. The door swung open with a hiss. the cold air outside rushing in to fill the vacuum of tension. The marble floor turned to concrete beneath John's polished shoes, the lobby's warmth replaced by the chill of the city. He felt the stairs on his back like hot coals even as the door closed behind him, cutting him off from the murmur of speculation that would continue without him. Outside, a small crowd had already begun to gather near the windows, pressed up against the glass, their breath fogging it as they watched the spectacle conclude. Some held up their phones, recording through the glass, narrating for unseen audiences. "They're throwing him out," one man breathed with excitement. "Look at that," another woman muttered. "He must have done something. Banks don't just kick people out for nothing." The words stabbed with surgical precision. John didn't flinch, though the guards released him with synchronized movements, stepping back like they were completing a dance routine. One of them nodded to the door in a silent command. "Leave. Go. Disappear." John's eyes swept the glass doors. He could see Melissa behind the counter, pretending to help the next customer with a bright, hollow smile, as though nothing had happened. The older woman with the pearls had turned away, rummaging in her purse. The man with the gray suit was still typing, narrating to someone unseen. The mother was hugging her daughter too tightly, eyes darting to the exit to ensure he was really gone. No one met his gaze. No one invited him back in. He stood on the steps of the bank for a moment longer, letting the cold seep into his bones, his breath coming in even, controlled puffs of vapor. He adjusted his tie once, slow and deliberate, his fingers moving with the care of someone refusing to show they were shaking. He heard laughter from somewhere behind the glass, a sharp bark of amusement quickly muffled when the speaker realized it had carried. It wasn't the laughter of joy. It was the laughter of relief that it wasn't them. John let the moment drag, refusing to turn away immediately, forcing them to keep watching him watch them. His eyes scanned each face behind the glass, memorizing them. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was something colder, calculated. He tucked one hand in his coat pocket, fingers brushing the edge of his phone. He could make a call right now. He could end this all in seconds. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he exhaled slowly, watching the glass fog with the remnants of his breath. The guards shifted uneasily, exchanging a look, clearly wanting him to go away so they could return to their post. But he lingered, rooted, immovable, until the moment was done. John lingered on the cold concrete steps outside the bank, his breath forming thin clouds in the air as the lobby behind the glass returned to its well-rehearsed pretense of polite service. Inside, customers resumed their transactions with forced calm, the brief spectacle of his removal quickly folding into embarrassed silence, as if everyone agreed it hadn't really happened at all. The guards had retreated back to their stations, shooting him occasional uneasy glances through the glass, hoping he'd just go away so they wouldn't have to think about the way they'd manhandled a client who'd done nothing but try to make a deposit. John kept his eyes steady on the door, his stance unbending, refusing to slink away in defeat. His fingers brushed the edge of his phone in his pocket, but he didn't call anyone yet. He watched as the automatic doors slid open and closed with mechanical precision, swallowing up and spitting out customer after customer, none of whom spared him more than a sideways glance. He could see Melissa behind the counter, her expression perfectly neutral as she smiled at the next in line, her voice pitched in that carefully modulated tone designed to reassure, to comfort, to hide. A child on the sidewalk tugged at her father's coat, asking in a clear, curious voice, "Why is that man standing there?" The father didn't answer. He just dragged the girl along faster, eyes averted, as if proximity to John's presence might stain him. And then the doors opened again with a whoosh that felt like a shift in the wind, and out strode the branch manager. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with slicked back hair and a navy suit that gleamed with the subtle shine of expensive tailoring. He wore his authority like a second skin, his every movement designed to project confidence that had calcified into arrogance. He took one look at John and let out a sharp exhale, as if disappointed but unsurprised to see him still there. He didn't bother to hide his annoyance. He came to a stop just a foot from John, arms folded, lips twisted into something that might have been a smile if not for the coldness in his eyes. "Mr. Thompson," he said, voice loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. drawing attention to their standoff. "We've had multiple complaints about you causing a disruption in our lobby." The words were precise, chosen to establish blame immediately, to paint John as the problem. John didn't move. He let the accusation hang between them before replying, voice level. "I came to make a deposit. Your staff decided to treat me like a criminal." The manager snorted softly. "Don't play innocent. We have protocols for a reason. You people should know better than to cause trouble here." The phrase dropped like a hammer. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were calculated, delivered with the bored condescension of someone convinced of their righteousness. "You people." Two words that did the work of 100 insults, drawing an invisible line between who belonged and who didn't. John's eyes narrowed, but he didn't give the man the satisfaction of looking outraged. Instead, he pulled the folder from beneath his arm and flipped it open with deliberate slowness, presenting his ID, account details, and the full transaction paperwork. He held it out. The manager didn't even glance at it. Instead, he flicked it with 2 fingers, the papers rustling in John's grip as they nearly tumbled to the ground. "I don't need to see that," the manager said with open disdain. "We can't risk letting someone like you defraud us." He said it flatly, without apology, like he was explaining basic math to a slow student. The words were delivered with bureaucratic finality, the tone that said this was policy, objective fact, nothing personal. So why was John making it personal? Around them, passers-by slowed, their steps hesitant, their ears straining for the sound of conflict while their eyes refused to meet either man's gaze for long. The manager straightened his cuffs, as if bored with the interaction already, and made a small, dismissive motion with his hand. "This is private property. I suggest you leave before we have to involve the police." John's grip tightened on the folder, the edges of the documents biting into his palm. He watched the manager's eyes, saw no flicker of doubt or remorse. Just calculation, just the certainty that he could talk this way and no one would challenge him. John's voice was low and controlled when he spoke. "I am a shareholder in this bank," he said slowly, biting off each word so there could be no confusion. "My money keeps your doors open." The manager let out a dry chuckle, eyes flashing with something like pity or mockery. "Oh, I'm sure," he drawled, emphasizing the sarcasm so thickly it dripped. "Look, you can take your story somewhere else. We're not falling for it here." He leaned forward slightly, dropping his voice so only John could hear the next words. "You're lucky we didn't call the cops already. Don't push it." The threat was delivered so casually it almost sounded like advice. John felt his pulse in his temples, the cold wind biting at his ears as his grip on the folder tightened. He inhaled through his nose once, slow and steady, fighting the old urge to roar back, to let the anger take over. Instead, he forced his voice calm. "I can prove who I am," he said again, extending the papers another inch. The manager didn't even look down. He simply raised one eyebrow and shook his head, the universal sign for no, delivered with all the practiced elegance of someone who'd done this before. John saw his own reflection in the manager's polished sunglasses, saw the set of his own jaw, the fury controlled only by years of knowing what they wanted him to do. They wanted the outburst. They wanted the spectacle. They wanted the proof they were right to fear him. The manager spoke again, his tone dripping with finality. "This conversation is over, Mr. Thompson. You're done here. If you don't leave, I'll call the authorities myself. And trust me, they'll take my word over yours." He turned then, as though dismissing a particularly dull meeting, checking his watch with bored precision and glancing back toward the door. Inside, the staff pretended not to watch, but their eyes flickered through the glass. The older woman with the pearls was back at the counter, pointedly ignoring the scene outside while nodding at Melissa's pleasant small talk. The guards inside shifted their weight uneasily, watching their manager on the sidewalk, but making no move to intervene. John let the silence hang between them, refusing to turn away first, his eyes boring into the manager's self-satisfied smirk. John stood his ground on the cold sidewalk, his grip on the folder unrelenting even as the bank manager's smirk stretched across his face like an old, worn mask. The traffic on the street hummed steadily in the background, but out here on the steps, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them, one man clinging to dignity, the other weaponizing authority like a club. The manager let out a long, theatrical sigh, glancing over his shoulder at the glass doors where staff pretended not to watch. He shifted his weight, checking his watch ostentatiously, as if John were merely an inconvenient delay in an otherwise busy, important day. "Mr. Thompson," he said, drawing out the name with exaggerated politeness that dripped condescension. "I don't have time for this. Leave. Now." John's eyes didn't flicker. He held them steady, voice calm but iron hard. "This is my bank. I have an account here. I have a right to be here. I am not leaving." The manager snorted, a quick exhalation that could have been a laugh if it weren't so ugly. "Your bank," he repeated, voice lilting in disbelief. "Listen to yourself. Do you really think shouting your delusions is going to help you here?" He gestured broadly to the sidewalk, inviting the world to share in his amusement. "You're trespassing. You've been asked to leave multiple times. If you don't go now, I'll have to call the police." John's mouth tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. He knew better. He'd been in rooms with board members who called him partner, while hiding the same sneer behind polite language. He'd heard worse in his time, but never with this much brazen disrespect delivered in the open. "Call them," he said evenly. "I'll show them my documents, my ID, my account details, my investment record with your bank. Let them see who's actually trespassing on whose property." The manager's smile flickered at the edges, just for a heartbeat, revealing the brittle rage behind it. He took a half-step closer, lowering his voice, as if wanting to share a secret. "You think anyone's going to believe that? You think a couple of papers are going to convince them you belong here?" He didn't bother waiting for an answer. Instead, he straightened and waved toward the doors. Through the glass, the security guards perked up, exchanging a quick, silent communication like soldiers awaiting orders. The manager lifted 2 fingers and gestured outward, the message clear. The guards nodded and pushed through the doors, their movements deliberate, the metal handles clacking like a starting gun. John didn't move. He watched them approach, their expressions grim and determined, the same two who had escorted him out before. They stopped on either side of him, forming a human barrier between John and the door, as if they were worried he might try to break back in. The taller guard cleared his throat, voice deep and tinged with forced sympathy that didn't fool anyone. "Sir," he began, drawing out the word like he was addressing a misbehaving child, "we're going to need you to move along." John let out a short, humorless breath, his lips pressing into a hard line. "No," he said simply. "I have business here. I have every right to be here." The shorter guard let out a soft laugh that was anything but kind. "Yeah, sure, Mr. Billionaire," he sneered, leaning in so close John could see the faint stubble on his jaw. "Go try that line on someone who'll actually believe you." The taller one chuckled under his breath, eyes flicking to the manager for approval, which he received in the form of a thin-lipped nod. "Look, you can make this easy or hard," the taller guard continued. "But either way, you're leaving." John's eyes flickered to the folder in his hand, the pages rumpled from his grip. He held it up just enough to make sure they saw it. "This is everything you need," he said quietly, each word sharpened to a blade. "My account number, my identity, my authority. You're violating your own policy by refusing to process it." The shorter guard snorted. "Yeah, and I'm the King of England. Let's go." He grabbed John's elbow roughly, his fingers digging in through the wool of John's coat. John's muscles tensed, but he didn't resist. He refused to give them any excuse to escalate it further. But he didn't make it easy for them either. He stood heavy, rooted, forcing them to put effort into moving him. So they had to strain and grunt as they half-dragged, half-walked him another few steps from the door. The manager followed them at a leisurely pace, his shoes clicking against the concrete like applause for their performance. John kept his chin high, eyes straight ahead. He refused to look at the gathering crowd on the sidewalk that had begun to form again, drawn by the escalating scene. Phones were out now, more openly than before. He heard the click of a camera, the hush of people narrating quietly for their followers. "They're kicking him out again," someone whispered. "What did he even do?" another voice asked. "He must have threatened them," came a confident reply. "Banks don't just kick people out for nothing." John heard it all. He cataloged every word, every assumption, every convenient lie they told themselves to avoid having to care. The taller guard's grip shifted to John's shoulder, pushing him firmly. "Come on, let's go. Don't make a scene." John let out a dry, humorless laugh that surprised even him. "You think I'm the one making a scene?" The guard's face hardened. "Enough. Keep talking and we'll call the cops for real. Trespassing, disturbing the peace, threatening staff." The words rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, as if he'd said them 100 times before. John's eyes snapped to his. "Threatening staff? I asked to make a deposit." The guard didn't blink. "That's not what they said. Management says you refuse to leave. That's trespassing." John felt the anger rising, boiling in his chest, but he forced it down. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, inhaling slowly through his nose, letting the cold air scrape his lungs clean. When he opened them again, the manager was standing just behind the guards, arms folded, watching with that same infuriating calm, as if supervising a garbage pickup. The manager's voice cut in, smooth as oil, but twice as slick. "You see, Mr. Thompson? This is what happens when you refuse to follow simple instructions. I gave you every chance to leave quietly, but you insisted on making it a problem." John's lip twitched. "My only problem is you refusing to do your job." The manager's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "My job is to keep my customers safe, to protect the bank's reputation. I'm not about to let someone pull a stunt like this and compromise our integrity." He gestured at the folder, still clutched in John's white-knuckled grip. "Anyone can print papers. Doesn't mean a thing." John's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Check them. I dare you." The manager didn't even glance down. He shook his head with exaggerated pity. "No, Mr. Thompson. I think we're done here." He waved a hand, dismissing him like a waiter clearing a table. The guards tightened their grips, starting to move him even farther away from the door, each step a forced surrender John refused to make willingly. The guards finally released John at the edge of the property, their fingers uncoiling from his arms like he was something toxic they needed to set down carefully without getting any on them. He adjusted his coat slowly, deliberately smoothing the rumples their rough handling had left, while they hovered a few feet away, watching him with impassive faces that couldn't fully hide their relief at being done. He didn't speak. He didn't turn back toward them. He just let the cold wind hit his face and stood there a moment longer, as if daring them to admit out loud what this really was. But they wouldn't, of course. They just shifted their weight awkwardly, clearing their throats, glancing at each other for silent permission to leave. Finally, they backed away, returning to the warm glow of the lobby like soldiers retreating to barracks after a job well done. John didn't move right away. He stared at the bank's polished glass doors that now seemed to gleam with smug self-satisfaction, reflecting back his own silhouette in distorted pieces. Inside, the world seemed to resume as if nothing had happened, as if the spectacle outside had been nothing more than an unsightly distraction quickly brushed away. He watched the doors part and close for other customers, the automatic mechanism welcoming them with a hushed grace he himself had been denied. As he turned to leave the sidewalk, the sounds of the city washed over him, car horns, tires hissing on wet pavement, a distant siren. And for a moment the bank became just another building among many, faceless and forgettable. But inside, it was anything but forgettable. Inside, the lobby was buzzing with a return to normalcy that felt aggressively forced. Melissa sat at her station, her posture carefully straight, fingers tapping on her keyboard with pointed diligence. She avoided eye contact with the next customer in line, a middle-aged man in a windbreaker who cast a wary glance at the door before leaning forward and whispering. What was that all about? Melissa kept her voice soft, professionally hushed, but not so quiet it couldn't be overheard. "Company policy," she said primly, fingers never stopping their rhythmic typing. "We have to be cautious. You understand?" The man nodded sagely, grateful to be reassured. "Yeah, you can't be too careful these days." Melissa offered a tight, complicit smile, as though they shared an unspoken truth. Just behind her, the manager was already holding court near the printer station, his back to the teller line, but voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "Well, I'd say we dodged a scam today," he announced with mock relief, his tone dripping with triumphant sarcasm. The staff clustered around him chuckled, some nervously, others with genuine mean-spirited delight, their eyes flicking sideways to make sure customers weren't listening too closely even as they couldn't help themselves. The manager spread his hands expansively, miming a shrug of disbelief. "I mean, can you believe it? He really thought he could fool us with those printouts." He let the laughter roll around him, basking in it like applause. One of the junior tellers piped up timidly. "What did he say his name was again?" The manager smirked, leaning back on the counter. "Thompson. Something Thompson. Claimed he was some big investor, or..." He cut himself off with an incredulous laugh. "Please. We're not idiots. We know exactly what that was." Another teller giggled, covering her mouth. "Well, you handled it professionally." The manager gave her an approving nod, tapping his temple like he was sharing trade secrets. "It's all about staying calm. Don't let them rattle you. That's what these people want." A big scene. Some sob story. He let his eyes sweep the little circle of staff, ensuring they were all nodding along. "We didn't fall for it," he concluded proudly. "We protected the bank. That's our job." Melissa finally allowed herself a tiny smile, glancing quickly at the next customer before looking back down at her screen. "Company policy," she repeated under her breath, like a prayer warding off guilt. Over by the coffee machine, one of the guards who'd escorted John out was pouring himself a cup with a slightly shaky hand, trying to look busy. The other guard clapped him on the back, forcing a laugh. "Hey, you did good, man," he said too loudly. "That guy was crazy. Tried to bluff us." The first guard snorted, but there was unease in his eyes as he stared at the swirling coffee. "Yeah, crazy." The second one lowered his voice and added conspiratorially. "You saw how he acted. All calm and polite at first, then trying to act all entitled. Classic scam artist move. I'm telling you, it's always the polite ones." The guard by the coffee didn't answer, but he gave a stiff nod, as though trying to lock the lie into place in his own head. At the front counter, another customer, a young woman in a red coat, raised her eyebrows when she heard the tail end of the manager's bragging. "That seemed a little harsh," she said cautiously. The manager wheeled on her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am," he said with patient condescension, "I understand it can look bad, but trust me, we have protocols for a reason. We can't just let anyone walk in off the street and claim to be a millionaire. That's how fraud happens." She shifted uncomfortably. "I guess," but he didn't let her finish. He patted the counter as if sealing the conversation shut. "Company policy," he repeated with finality. "We protect our real customers." The phrase hung there like a bad smell. She didn't argue further. Instead, she lowered her eyes to her purse, fumbling with her cards as if they might rescue her from the discomfort. Behind her, the line shuffled forward with renewed determination to mind their own business. Melissa coughed gently to reset the moment, then offered her best trained smile. "Next, please," she called out, her voice bright and clear. It was almost a relief for everyone to fall back into the script. The manager, satisfied with his performance, turned back to the staff and clapped his hands once, signaling the show was over. "All right, everyone, let's stay sharp. Remember, firm but polite. We don't need any more excitement today." They all nodded in solemn agreement, eager to please, grateful to have a leader who could turn a moment of potential scandal into a lesson in professional spin. Even the guards seemed to relax a fraction, shoulders loosening as they returned to their post by the door, glancing outside only once, ensuring John was no longer in view, no longer a threat to the clean, well-lit lie they'd managed to restore inside. Outside on the concrete steps, with a wind cut sharper than any insult, John adjusted his coat slowly, fingers stiff from cold and anger alike, the battered folder still tucked resolutely under his arm. He didn't bother looking back through the glass doors, though he knew the manager and staff inside were already rewriting the story for themselves, patting each other on the back for their vigilance, congratulating themselves for their professionalism. They could lie to themselves all they wanted. He wasn't finished. He inhaled deeply, letting the icy air clear his mind of the last smirking words from the manager, the dismissive wave, the refusal to even glance at the documents. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, thumb sliding over the screen with practiced precision, finding the contact with no hesitation. His jaw tightened as he pressed call, lifting it to his ear with deliberate calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He didn't let even a hint of tremor bleed through. "It's me," he said quietly when the call connected. He listened to the response on the other end, the familiar, professional voice cutting through the line with crisp efficiency. He nodded once, though no one was there to see. "Yes," he confirmed, voice low and steady. "I'm outside. Bring it now." He paused, letting the words hang before he added, "All of it. I want no mistakes." He ended the call without another word, letting the phone slide back into his pocket as he exhaled slowly, eyes still fixed ahead. He didn't bother pacing. He stood absolutely still, the calm center of the storm they didn't even realize was about to break over them. The traffic on the street continued obliviously, taxis honking, delivery trucks rumbling over potholes, pedestrians bustling past him with barely a glance. But John didn't see any of it. He only saw the reflection in the glass doors, the distorted outlines of the people inside laughing, rearranging paperwork, talking among themselves, as if they'd won something, as if he'd been an inconvenience they'd expertly removed. He waited and waited. It didn't take long. Less than 5 minutes after he hung up, an unmarked black car appeared at the curb. Its windows tinted so dark they reflected only the cloudy sky overhead. It glided to a stop with that precise smoothness that spoke of careful high-dollar maintenance, engine purring into silence like a predator settling to wait. The driver's door opened first, a suited figure stepping out quickly to check the surroundings before moving to the rear door and pulling it open with clean, mechanical efficiency. From inside emerged a younger man in his late 20s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal-gray tailored suit that didn't so much hang on his frame as armor it. His hair neatly combed back, a leather portfolio clutched tightly in one gloved hand. His shoes crunched on the salt-dusted sidewalk as he moved with brisk, determined steps, eyes locking immediately on John. "Mr. Thompson," he greeted without fanfare, voice even, respectful, without any hint of obsequiousness. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations. He simply closed the distance and extended the portfolio with both hands as if offering a sacred relic. John accepted it silently, the thick leather warm from the car's heater, and flipped it open just enough to verify the contents. Neat rows of documents were organized with meticulous precision: certificates, balance sheets, investment reports, board meeting minutes, shareholder resolutions, all bearing his name in bold, unmissable print. The assistant shifted slightly, waiting for John's nod of approval before relaxing a hair. But he remained vigilant, eyes sweeping the front of the bank where the glass doors hid the staff who had so confidently dismissed their most important client only moments before. Inside, it seemed the staff had noticed the arrival of the car. Melissa's face turned from polite customer service placidity to wary confusion as she watched through the glass, eyes flicking from the sleek vehicle to the two men on the sidewalk. The manager, mid-laugh at some off-color remark to a colleague, stopped when he saw Melissa's expression shift. He followed her gaze, his own brow furrowing as he registered the car, the driver waiting stiffly at the door, the assistant now standing at John's shoulder like a lawyer ready to deliver opening statements. The manager's smirk didn't quite vanish, but it did crack at the edges. John didn't hurry. He flipped through the first few pages deliberately, letting the wind rustle the paper just enough to give the moment weight. He closed the portfolio carefully and handed it back to the assistant. "We're going in," he said quietly. The assistant gave a single nod, turning on his heel with military precision, already moving toward the doors before John even followed. The automatic glass parted for them with a gentle hiss, the sudden gust of warm air from inside colliding with the icy draft outside like two clashing fronts. But the real collision was still to come. The guards at the door straightened immediately, one of them half raising a hand as if to block them. his mouth already forming a protest. But the assistant didn't break stride. He lifted the portfolio just enough for them to see the embossed seal on the cover, his eyes cold and direct. "Step aside," he ordered in a voice that could have frozen the Atlantic. The guard blinked, mouth working soundlessly, thrown off by the absolute authority in the tone. The second guard moved uncertainly, his hand drifting to his belt radio, but stopping short as the assistant's words sliced through the growing tension with surgical precision. "Step aside," he repeated, slower, each word its own sentence. The first guard swallowed, glanced quickly at his partner, then at the manager hovering 10 feet behind them, whose face had gone pale in increments as he processed what was unfolding. The manager opened his mouth, preparing to bark an order that would reassert control of the situation. But the assistant beat him to it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm here on behalf of the majority shareholder," he said, letting the words fall like an indictment. The silence that followed was instant, suffocating. Every customer in the lobby seemed to freeze, heads swiveling from the manager to the suited assistant, eyes darting to John standing calmly behind him. The guards hesitated for a heartbeat longer before stepping clumsily back, the line between authority and servility redrawn in an instant. The assistant didn't spare them another glance. He turned slightly, just enough to angle his shoulder so John could step through the now cleared doorway, the invitation unmistakable. John didn't hesitate. He crossed the threshold slowly, each step deliberate, his gaze sweeping the lobby with the cold appraisal of a man reclaiming territory that had always been his. He felt the stares pierce him from every direction, fear, confusion, dawning recognition. But he didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't rush. John crossed the threshold with a stillness that wasn't hesitant but lethal in its certainty, the assistant falling into step half a pace behind him as the lobby fell utterly silent, every hushed conversation, every polite pretense of indifference evaporating like fog under a rising sun. The bank's sterile corporate lighting seemed to catch on every expensive thread of John's tailored coat, on the leather-bound portfolio in the assistant's grip, on the sharp focus in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't here for anyone's approval. Inside, the manager had lost the easy smirk that had defined every moment of his previous smug dismissal, his face pale and tight, eyes darting from John to the guards, who now hovered uselessly at either side of the door like malfunctioning automatons. But before the manager could stammer out a greeting or demand an explanation to claw back control of the narrative, the glass doors at the far end of the lobby whooshed open again and drew every eye with the same gravitational pull as a car crash. Through them swept 3 new arrivals in perfectly cut dark suits, moving with the kind of unhurried precision that spoke of habit rather than effort. 2 were attorneys, their legal pads and phones in hand, heads angled toward each other in brisk, whispered consultation even as they moved in perfect step. The third was the regional executive himself, a man whose reputation in the company was built on a shark's instinct for blood in the water, and whose expression now carried the exact blend of alarm and forced composure that only emerged when something had gone very, very wrong. His eyes locked on John instantly, his steps accelerating just enough to signal urgency without devolving into an undignified rush. When he reached John, he didn't waste time with pleasantries or excuses. He came to a full stop, offered a firm, sincere nod, and said with a voice pitched to carry to every corner of the suddenly breathless lobby, "Mr. Thompson, we apologize for the disgraceful welcome you received here today." The words weren't a suggestion. They weren't a diplomatic half-measure or a corporate non-apology. They were a public admission of failure, and they cracked the tension in the room like glass under a hammer. The tellers froze in place, hands hovering over keyboards. Melissa's fingers slipped on the counter, so hard her pen clattered to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud. The guards swallowed visibly, shifting on their feet, glancing sidelong at each other with wide, uncertain eyes. The manager's mouth opened, closed, opened again, the words failing him completely as the blood drained from his face. John didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge the gasps or the way every customer in the room seemed to pivot to watch him with new eyes, the fear and suspicion slowly transforming into something like morbid curiosity. He simply gave the regional executive a single, measured nod of acknowledgement, accepting the apology with the quiet authority of someone who knew it was owed to him, not granted as a favor. The regional executive turned to the staff, his eyes hardening. "We'll be using the executive meeting room," he snapped with crisp efficiency. "Clear the hall." Now, he didn't raise his voice, but the command carried a violence sharper than any shout. The attorneys moved in to flank John on either side like bodyguards escorting a head of state, the assistant a half step behind, the portfolio tucked carefully under one arm. Together they advanced deeper into the bank, the polished floor reflecting the small, unstoppable procession. The customers parted without being asked, stepping back instinctively, as if they'd just realized they'd been standing on train tracks. One whispered audibly, voice trembling with incredulity, "Wait, he owns the bank." Another customer, a college-aged woman with earbuds dangling from her neck, turned to her friend and muttered, "Holy crap, did you hear that? He's not just a customer, he's the owner." Her friend shushed her frantically, but not before the words rippled outward like a stone dropped in water. The rumor spread instantly, carried in hisses and sharp exhalations, the lobby filling with the rustle of people craning their necks for a better view. Even the guards stepped back as the group approached, their professional stoicism cracking to reveal the raw, exposed confusion beneath. One of them opened his mouth as if to speak, then shut it quickly when the regional executive leveled a glare at him that promised consequences for even one more misstep. The manager was the last obstacle in their path, rooted to the floor in a parody of defiance, arms folded so tightly across his chest his knuckles whitened. But as the group drew closer, his chin wobbled imperceptibly, his eyes darting to the attorneys, who now fixed him with a cold, unblinking stare of men who had already drafted the termination paperwork in their heads. He tried one last gambit, voice cracking with forced authority. I don't think we need to escalate this, Mr. Thompson. If you just," the regional executive cut him off with a single, slicing motion of his hand. "Not another word," he commanded icily. He didn't even look at the manager, dismissing him like an insect on a windowsill. The group passed him without slowing. John's shoulder brushed the manager's arm with deliberate subtlety, the faintest contact that said everything words didn't need to. The manager recoiled as if burned, face flushing bright red before going sheet white again, eyes tracking John with a haunted stare of someone realizing too late that they'd bet everything on the wrong outcome. Behind them, the lobby was chaos in polite whispers. Customers pointed. Phones recorded in secret. Staff whispered frantically to each other over powered-down terminals. One teller actually dropped to a crouch to retrieve Melissa's fallen pen, but forgot to hand it back, frozen mid-motion as his eyes stayed locked on the unfolding parade. John didn't speak as they turned down the side hall leading to the executive meeting room, but the attorneys did. One leaned in just enough to murmur, "We'll handle the documentation, sir. You shouldn't have to speak unless you want to." The assistant kept pace without looking away from the portfolio, fingers curled protectively around the spine as if guarding a priceless artifact. At the door to the executive room, the regional executive paused only to yank it open with a sharp motion, gesturing for John to enter first with a flourish that was anything but performative. John walked through without hesitation, the lawyers following, the assistant closing the door behind them with a soft click that cut off the lobby's frantic noise like a guillotine. Inside the executive meeting room, the air was colder than the lobby despite the polished wood table, and the subtle hum of recessed lighting meant to project calm, authority, and wealth, the silence settling over the assembled group like a shroud too heavy to ignore. John lowered himself deliberately into the high-backed chair at the head of the table, his assistant standing just behind him, the portfolio laid out before him like a shield and a sword both. The attorneys took seats flanking him, papers at the ready, pens uncapped with an almost ceremonial gravity, while the regional executive stayed standing near the door for a moment, taking in the room with a hard, evaluating stare that promised no one was escaping this unscathed. He crossed quickly to the conference phone at the center of the table and pressed a single button. The tiny green light glowed like an accusing eye as the call went live, the corporate office crackling into being with crisp audio. "This is HQ," a voice said, precise and businesslike, the accent neutral but cold. "We're ready to begin." The regional executive didn't bother with pleasantries. "We're live with Mr. John Thompson," he announced, his voice carrying the subtle tremor of adrenaline held just in check. "He is our majority shareholder, and he has just been forcibly removed from his own branch. We will be addressing it now." The room shifted collectively, the weight of those words pressing on every occupant's chest. Even the guards who'd been forcibly corralled into the back of the room to witness this stood with their hands clasped in front of them, faces drained of any defiance, their eyes darting anywhere but at John. The manager sat stiffly at the far end of the table, shoulders rigid, mouth working like he wanted to speak, but no words coming, a sweat stain forming at the collar of his once crisp shirt. The corporate voice on the speaker was ice. "Mr. Thompson, you have the floor." John didn't look at the phone. He didn't even look at the manager. His eyes rested on the portfolio for a moment before lifting to sweep the entire room in one slow, measured glance that seemed to strip everyone bare. He said nothing. The silence itself was its own accusation, heavier than any speech. Finally, the regional executive cleared his throat, breaking the unbearable quiet. "Branch manager," he snapped, his voice a whip crack. "Explain yourself. Now." The manager jumped as if electrocuted, blinking rapidly. It was a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice strangled, eyes desperately scanning the room for support and finding none. "We have protocols, security protocols. Large deposits, possible fraud." His voice cracked and fell apart like rotted wood under pressure. He licked his lips, tried again. "I didn't know who he was. We have to protect the bank's assets." His words landed like lead weights in a pool, sinking without a ripple, failing to disturb the terrible calm in John's expression. The corporate voice on the phone was no longer simply cold, it was glacial. "We have seen the security footage," it said. "We have read the initial reports. There was no attempt to verify Mr. Thompson's identity beyond dismissing his paperwork. Your own security footage shows the folder being physically pushed away." The manager's mouth opened, breath catching on a sound that might have been a sob or a protest before dying in his throat. The guards shifted again, the older one swallowing audibly. John still said nothing. He didn't blink. He didn't nod. He let the weight of their own words drown them. His silence the sharpest blade in the room. The regional executive's hand hovered over the phone controls, his expression carved from stone. "HQ," he said tightly. "Recommendation." The corporate voice didn't hesitate. "Immediate suspension pending termination review," it pronounced with the detached finality of a judge passing sentence. For the branch manager, for both security staff who physically removed Mr. Thompson. Effective immediately. The words hit like hammer blows. The manager slumped back in his chair as if the strings holding him up had been cut. One guard actually let out a soft gasp, his eyes wide and wet, his mouth working soundlessly. The other closed his eyes, shoulders slumping in defeat. HQ's voice wasn't finished. "We expect full compliance with our anti-discrimination policies. We will be conducting a region-wide audit. Zero tolerance will be enforced." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the assistant behind John seemed to hold his breath, his fingers tapping lightly against the leather of the portfolio, as if keeping time in a funeral march. Finally, John's eyes cut to the manager for the first time. The room felt like it contracted around that gaze, the weight of it pressing the manager down into his chair. The manager's mouth trembled. "Mr. Thompson, please," he began, voice cracking, the desperation plain now, all dignity long gone. I didn't mean I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We were just following procedure. I didn't know." He seemed to crumple further with every word, his eyes going wet and red, voice hitching as he broke completely. "Please, don't do this. I have a family. It was a mistake." One of the guards blurted out too, voice high and cracked with panic. "Sir, we were just doing our job. We didn't mean any harm. Please. We'll do better. We'll learn. Just give us another chance." The apologies rang hollow in the polished room, the words dropping and splattering on the floor like dirty water that no one wanted to mop up. John didn't speak right away. He let them say every cowardly, belated thing they could think of, let them drain themselves of every excuse and plea until the only thing left was the ragged sound of their breathing. Then he turned slowly, deliberately, to the regional executive. His voice was low and steady, colder than the phone speaker, sharper than any punishment yet levied. "Enforce company policy," he said, each word clipped like a cut. "No tolerance for discrimination." He didn't look at the manager again. He didn't look at the guards. He didn't even look at the lawyers taking frantic notes. He simply sat back in the chair, exhaled slowly through his nose, and turned his gaze back to the portfolio in front of him like the entire spectacle was already over and done, a problem solved and discarded. Months passed like the turning of silent pages in a ledger no one wanted to audit too closely. The scandal that had once sent shockwaves through the bank's corporate corridors, settling into the dusty archives of institutional memory, officially addressed, but never truly forgotten. The main branch was renovated, staff retrained under shiny new policies with glossy slogans about diversity and respect pinned to the walls, like medals no one had earned. But the real story shifted to the city's edge, to a small, aging community branch with faded signage and sun-bleached blinds rattling in the breeze. Here the foot traffic was steady but humble, a mosaic of neighbors who spoke half a dozen languages among them and traded recipes as often as paychecks. Into this branch on a gray, unremarkable Tuesday morning walked a man who had once worn a $1,000 suit with the smugness of armor, now wearing an off-the-rack navy blazer that still sat stiff on his shoulders, no matter how he tried to relax it. The former branch manager, no longer sir to any corporate bigwig, held the door open for an elderly Latina woman pushing a walker, greeting her with a genuine "Good morning, Mrs. Reyes. How's your leg feeling today?" that cracked with nerves at the end. She smiled, her lined face softening, and patted his arm with a grandmotherly forgiveness he had never deserved but accepted anyway. He guided her to the front of the short line with an apologetic glance to the other customers, who nodded back without malice. These weren't the high-net-worth clients he used to boast about courting. They were teachers, bus drivers, grocery clerks, day laborers, single parents juggling kids, and overdraft fees. And he greeted every one of them, repeating names he had memorized by sheer force of will, refusing to let even one slip away without a personal touch. Behind the counter, his staff, once wary of a new manager corporate had dumped on them, now watched him with a mix of surprise and cautious respect as he offered to help fix the jammed ATM receipt slot himself, rolling up his sleeves instead of calling maintenance. He'd learned how to refill the lobby's coffee machine without complaint. He knew which customers wanted their cash in 10s and 5s. He made sure to explain overdraft protection carefully instead of using it as an upsell. And when the new hire, a young black woman just out of college, asked him if she should call security on a nervous man who didn't have ID for a small withdrawal, he held up a hand, took the time to check the system, and personally walked the man through the verification process with the patience of someone who had once needed that same mercy and been denied it. The days blurred together into routines that were harder, but somehow cleaner than anything he'd known before. He no longer laughed off those kinds of customers in back offices. He no longer thought himself too important to hold the door or fetch change from a vault. The shame still sat heavy in his chest, an unwelcome tenant that refused eviction, but he learned to treat it like a compass instead of a chain. And then, one day, the door's little bell chimed in its tired, rattling way, and in walked a man he'd hoped never to see again, but had quietly dreamed of apologizing to every single night. John entered without fanfare, dressed in a simple charcoal coat, the collar up against the wind, no entourage or assistant trailing him. He carried no folder of ownership documents this time, no lawyer to flank him, no regional executive falling over himself in apology. He blended with the line, just another man waiting his turn in a community branch that had no brass plaques or marble floors to boast about. The manager, he no longer insisted on titles, froze for a single heartbeat when he saw him, the color draining from his face, hands going clammy at his sides. He felt the old shame surge so hard it threatened to choke him, but he forced himself to swallow it, to steady his breath. He made himself walk forward even though his legs trembled. John met his eyes with a calm that wasn't cold but impossibly heavy, layered with memory that neither of them could deny. The manager's mouth opened, cracked dry with old fear and new resolve. He wanted to say he was sorry. He wanted to say it 100 times. He wanted to beg for forgiveness outright. But all the scripts he'd rehearsed in the mirror fell away in that moment, useless. Instead, he cleared his throat, found the faintest wisp of a smile that felt genuine for the first time in months, and said simply, voice thick but steady, "Welcome. It's good to see you again." The words hung in the air like something sacred, fragile and mortal and real, a confession and a benediction all at once. John's gaze didn't waver. For a long moment he didn't speak, letting the silence do the work of both judge and jury, reminding them both of every humiliation, every insult, every choice that had led them here. Then, at last, he let the faintest curve of a smile play at the corner of his mouth, not triumphant, not mocking, but quietly, painfully human. He inclined his head just enough for anyone watching to see it was an acknowledgement, a receipt of the words offered. The manager exhaled shakily, shoulders slumping with a relief so profound he felt dizzy. Around them the bank hummed on, customers moving forward in line, staff busy with tasks, the world stubbornly refusing to grant them more ceremony than that. But for a moment it was enough. For a moment it was everything. The manager stepped aside, gesturing to the counter with a small, earnest motion. John nodded once more and walked forward without fanfare, just another customer in a bank that had learned, painfully, what that word was supposed to mean. Outside, the wind rattled the old signage, but the door closed with a soft click that felt like the end of something ugly and the tentative start of something better. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. I'm curious, what did you think about that final moment of forgiveness? Which part hit you the hardest? And tell me, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.